Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the E-Commerce Edge podcast. And this is actually our fourth and final episode in our ERP for B2B Master Series. And once again, I've got my friend and yours, Mr. Sam Gupta from Elevatiq, along with me for the ride today. Thank you for joining me again for this fourth and final episode in the series. I'm looking forward to it, my friend.
Of course, I'm looking forward to it as well. Enjoyed the whole series.
Me too. Look, we've covered a whole lot of ground so far, and I won't cover that all again. I have the last three episodes, but it would be a lot to cover off. But what I wanted to cover off today, and when we put this outline together, we wanted to round this out and try to put a big red bow around this fourth episode. We're going to cover several key topics today and subtopics underneath that. The first being adoption and change management. What does that look like? How do we adopt this platform into the business? How do we do it in such a way that doesn't completely destroy our business in the process? What are the training opportunities we have as part of the adoption of the platform? Do we train the trainer? Do we train end users? What are the pros and cons of those two different approaches? Then we start talk about what are some of the immediate post-go live activities. Cool. We've spent 6, 12, 18 months, whatever it is, getting this whiz bang wow, all singing, all dancing ERP live after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And then what are the immediate things we need to do post-live to ensure that we have data integrity, that we have data sanity, that we have process integrity, that we have all of the data modeling that we have to do and maintain and secure. How do we manage this Ferrari that we've implemented over the previous 12 plus months? Then we're going to look at why do ERP projects fail most typically, and what are some key mitigation strategies to helping you prevent failure with your ERP for B2B projects. So we're going to cover some good ground today, my friend. But let's kick it off with adoption and change management. Now, obviously, there's we could probably spend 4 episodes just talking about adoption and change management. But to your mind, what are the 1, 2, 3 key things that will ensure good internal adoption, good internal respect? Because I find that sometimes when an ERP has been implemented, people continue to work in their spreadsheets. They continue to work in different other pieces of tools because that's what they're still the most comfortable with, as opposed to doing work directly in the ERP. So give me your thoughts.
Yeah. So I'll start off by number one, defining what go live is. And that's what I have done in every single episode. So I'll maintain my consistency here. So generally, the way go live goes with most cases, you are going to say, hey, you know what, I have done maybe 2 months selection, maybe 6 months implementation, and now this is my D-Day, let's go live. You go live, great idea, you cut the cake, but then after that, everybody is shocked, because now they have to manage their workflow in the new system. Your expectation is going to be, as a business owner, let's say if you're funding this effort, is that everybody is going to be off to the races from day one. But that's not how it goes, because when you are during the implementation, again, your expectation is going to be that everybody would have tested, everybody would have understood what they were trying to get from the system, but there is a massive gap. So generally, when you have the real go live, that becomes a very disruptive experience for most people, because now they have to go through a real training, and you are training on a live platform. That could be a shocker for most people. So a lot of things happen. Number one, obviously, substantial disruption. It could be things such as you are not able to process sales order, you are not able to process invoices, taking too long to close your books. It could be so many different things that could go wrong in that process. Now, there is a term called stabilization. Generally, you are supposed to stabilize during the implementation, not post go live. So you end up doing the stabilization post go live. Now it could take 6 months. So now again, I'm going back to my thoughts. how do you define the implementation? What is an implementation, right? So if you had defined the space, okay, now we are going live, okay, I'm on budget, I'm on time, great idea, but then you are sinking a lot of funds afterwards, okay, and that could be far more, to be completely honest, because now you are locked in the system, you don't have a way to go back, right? If you are not running any sort of parallel system, which could be a topic in itself, if you are doing that, then you may have a chance to go back. If not, you need to learn to swim in the new system, right? Now, to your point related to change management, so this is all part of that change management process. How do you manage this massive change that it doesn't come across as a shocker? So again, my advice is going to be, change management is a very horizontal stream, and the way it works is it starts on day one in setting the right expectations. Okay, if you set the right expectations from day one, and that's, I'm going back to my phase zero strategy selection phase, that's when you start with the change management. Because unless people are ready in their mind, you they are always going to feel some sort of friction. And to your point, what is going to happen is, okay, now I'm scrambling, I went live here, okay, and I don't know how to complete my job, but I am required to complete my job right now. My boss is asking me, okay, give me this report, give me this data, whatever. I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do in my power to finish my job. Now, if that means hijacking the system, I'm going to do that. I don't care for anything else as the user. My job is to protect my job.
Or my team, or my team.
Exactly. Everybody is acting in their best, what is that, self-interest,
Self-interest, yeah.
right? Yeah, so that's how people work. There is no way around that. And if you really want to manage this change and you want to make sure that they don't hijack the traffic rules, then the only way is that they really need to buy into this. They need to get convinced that this is the change that is going to be required. They need to be told the story, how this is going to impact their job. You need to have some sort of incentive, compensation structure aligned to their priorities, so they really buy into that. Otherwise, they'll go out of their way to hijack the system. And then obviously you are not going to get much out of it. Whatever they are going to input, it's going to be all over the place. The insights are going to be all over the place. The data is going to be all over the place. That's the reality in general with most implementation. Again, the only way to do it is follow very methodical approach from day one, manage change, manage expectations, build really good core team, figure out all of the risks, and then figure out a reasonable plan that everybody's going to be able to digest. And digestion is probably the best term that I can throw in there, because again, it's a massive change for everybody. So unless you are giving them enough time, enough opportunities, you are telling them a story that this is going to be good for the company, in what sense, and obviously you need to articulate that as well, it's going to be a really hard change in general. So I'll pause there. I know I spoke a lot there.
I want to hone in on one of the things that you said there, which is, I think people can either intentionally or unintentionally sabotage the success of a project of this scale just because they are resistant to change, right? Humans, generally speaking, they like to have variety in their life, but they also like to have stability in their life. And those two are sometimes the antithesis of each other. And so when people go to work every day, they like to know what they're doing. They like to know what's expected of them. They like to know how they're going to get remunerated. They like to know what their KPIs are to be able to keep their job and maybe even move up the ranks within the business. And I think you're right. If we don't set the right expectations up front and we don't KPI people on the right things around adding to their KPIs, meaning if we don't treat the success, the onboarding, the usage, the adoption of these new technologies, and we don't add those as a KPI to the people, the subject matter experts or the specific team leads or whoever it is that is needed to help the business onboard and use this technology day to day, it probably won't happen. But if we tie some of their remuneration, if we tie some of their KPIs to the usage, the adoption, the dissemination of information, the training, the test planning, all of these things, if we don't tie KPIs, at least in the short to medium term, into and making a success factor of their job being the adoption of this new technology, and in many cases, not just new technology, it's actually new processes. Because
Yeah.
with new technology, especially as we've recommended before, don't go and try to force the system to adapt to your 20-year-old processes. Try to adapt your 20-year-old processes to work within the standard processes within the new system as much as humanly possible. So it means that they go from literally one day using an old system and old processes to the next day, once you're live, trying to use a new system and new processes. And even if they are in the right headspace, heart space, emotional space, whatever it is, to take this on, it is a mammoth ask. It is a mammoth ask, especially with a system that touches every single department in the business.
Exactly. And I'll talk about the training a little bit, because obviously training is a huge topic from the change management perspective. So in 90% of the cases, the way the training is done in general with businesses is, okay, let's say you spoke about train the trainer approach, right? So the train the trainer approach is going to be, hey, I, as the expert driver, I am going to show you how easy it is to drive the car. Okay, I'm going to show you. Anybody can do that. Okay, but the reality is that everybody is very different. Everybody learns differently. Even a task as simple as driving a car, which everybody should be able to do, it takes time for people to get it. Even minor simple operation, right? And let's say if I'm showing the way the trainings work in the ERP world, or any enterprise software for that matter, right? So I'm going to have this fancy structured training. I'm going to have a bunch of jokes, humor, great idea. But the way the trainings are supposed to be done, unless you move your body, okay, you are not going to build the muscle memory is what is going to be required when you are going to use this on day one, because otherwise it's going to be a lot of mental effort for you to be able to remember, okay, shortcut number one, screen number two, screen number, how many commands am I supposed to remember here to complete just one operation? Crazy, right? So that's where I guess that the major problem is in general with respect to training. And again, in most cases, what companies do is, let's go with the implementation that any of the SIs or VARs or OEMs they are going to recommend. Number one, and I think we spoke about this, that what you're going to get with them is going to be vendor speak. Okay, these users are very far off the language they speak, even though both might be saying project, but project could mean very different things for both of these parties, and there could be miscommunication because of that, right? Overall, when you go through these trainings with these, again, OEMs, SI or VAR, their trainings are very structured. They are going to dedicate, let's say, 2 days, 3 days. They may have conference room pilots, but the reality is that, and they might have some sort of checklist as well. Okay, I'll give you a checklist on day one. You simply need to follow this. It's probably going to be good. But most users are going to struggle with that because they have not practiced enough. Okay, you require real practice with these things that you have to do, and you can call it rehearsal or whatever, but you have to capture all of these scenarios that you are going to execute, let's say, on your day one. Okay, you have to rehearse that for some time. Now, when you account for this time, your implementation could look frightening, because you are going to feel that I was already paying $1 million. Now you are telling me that $1 million for training? Are you serious? Shall I
Just in
find
time alone, just in time.
Exactly. So now these guys are going to question, shall I find other people who are going to have a little bit of ERP experience? Can I get those? And are they going to be better rather than investing in these people? Look, regardless of the approach that you are going to take, you still have to train. Okay, and the training is where the major cost is of the implementation, and which generally, if you are going to take any sort of shortcut, or you are going to tell them that, you know what, I'm on a budget, then what these companies are going to do is they are going to short circuit on that training, because what is going to happen from their perspective is they are going to do go live, they are going to cut the cake, and they know that you are not going to be able to use the system. You will come back to me and I will be making a lot of money. So vendors are incentivized to sort of go faster with respect to their implementation, and then obviously they are going to have a bunch of case studies in the market that 2 weeks implementation. But the real implementation starts once you have actually implemented. Then that's when you are going to get the real taste of what an implementation and what a system is. So in my mind, I think that is still in very implementation phase, unless it is completely adopted, completely used, it becomes a fabric as part of your team.
And to your point, I think SIs or whoever, implementation partners, whatever it is, you're right. There is slightly misaligned incentives in the sense that the more dependency that they can create on them to be able to support you, to admin the system, to onboard new users, all that stuff. They're usually more than happy to take on a lot of that responsibility, but you're going to pay through the nose for it. And so you have to ask yourself, do I want short-term dependency or do I want long-term dependency on my implementation partner? And I think and you have to define what that means to the business. Short-term to some businesses is 6 months dependency. To some businesses, dependency on their implementation partner is 2 months. Sometimes I've seen short-term dependency stretch as long as 24 months post-live. And then, sometimes these businesses don't even know which things they want to own until they start using the system in actual production. And then they go, okay, I think we need to be trained up on this thing because we do not want to be dependent on our partner forever for this thing, but we only know it once we start using it, right? And I think that's the challenge, is that it's really hard to define some of these dependencies. It's difficult to identify, document, and create a game plan around these dependencies before you're actually live. That's the difficulty of this thing. You might think that you have this perfect plan, this perfect, what I like to call knowledge transfer or skills transfer from the partner to you, to your teams, to an internal admin, etc. But sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And you only figure that out once you're actually living in the system every single day, right? You see that too?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point as well. And in fact, one thing that you are not going to know and that you are going to learn hard way is that the way these professional services companies work is, okay, you talk about dependency, right? Great idea. So now I'm going to think that my implementation is complete, and as soon as I'm going to go live, I can probably always count on these guys. But from their side, the way they work is they are going to have a team dedicated for the project, because you have an agreed expected capacity that they are allocating. These are very highly compensated resources, so they need to plan for them as well. Nobody's going to pay them for free just in the hope that you are going to have some problem and I'm going to fix it. It doesn't work that way, right? So in most cases, what is going to happen is, if you don't have a clear plan in terms of how you will be utilizing the team, they are going to release those resources to some other projects. Now tomorrow, when you are going to have a problem, your hope is going to be that, can I get hold of that person? Now that person is gone.
They're already working on the next project. They're scoping.
Exactly. So let's start fresh now. Okay. So now you need to start again, because see, the new person who's going to come in, you need to do the knowledge transition to them. For them, it's very hard because they are coming in a new project. You have implemented so many things. Everybody implements their own way. Now, if you were really short on your budget, most likely you have not documented anything. If you have not documented anything, good luck. This person is going to take a long time for that. So that's where I guess you need to have a real balance of maintaining your internal capacity to some degree. You also need to have some sort of plan with this partner in terms of what capacity you are going to need from them, and you have to have very clear communication upfront. Again, this is a very strategic relationship. Okay, it's not going to be like, okay, I am maintaining my internal capacity, so I'm not going to need this partner or whoever worked on the project, right? You would probably need some capacity from them, at least until you are completely comfortable on the system processes. So my recommendation always is going to be that, okay, spend at least 6 months at least until you are running on the system, really running on the system. After 6 months, you probably don't need as much help, again depending upon how big the implementation is, but 6 months is probably a reasonable time to keep your internal capacity, some capacity from these partners as well. Even if you don't utilize that, you need to have some buffer, keep that as reserve, just in case if you have the disruption. Then what's going to happen, you are going to call these guys and they are not going to be available. Okay,
Yeah.
nobody's
And
going
then
to.
maybe it gets tossed over to the fence to a standard help desk person. And obviously, if they've got no specific knowledge of your implementation, then they're going to be giving you generic assistance, generic pointers, generic help. And sometimes that generic help might end up taking 4 times as long to resolve an issue than someone who's been intimately involved with your project for 12, 18, or 24 months in some instances. And so I agree with you. I think the challenge is, and I went through this, even when I was working merchant side, we implemented NetSuite ERP, and about 3/4 of the way through the project, our partner came to us and said, look, we're starting to get into the back portion of delivery here. We're literally within a month or two of going live. We're about ready to hit UAT. We're doing some end-to-end testing. We're doing some integration testing, etc. What would you guys like to reserve for in terms of resources post live, and for how long? And it was even my CEO, I think he used the term, how long's a piece of string? Like, it's so difficult to know in advance. It's so difficult to predict how much help you and support you are going to need from that third party, and for how long. And so you don't want to say, let's book someone for 6 months, and then you end up only using them part-time for 30 days. And then you feel like, oh my God, I wasted all this money on 6 months worth of one-to-one support, one-on-one support. Maybe it's a retainer of 30 hours or 40 hours a month of support for 6 months, something like that. So they effectively are on call for you when you need them in a crunch. If you go too slim and you try to cut the corner too much, then all of a sudden you could run into a situation where you become non-transactional, or an integration fails, or something bad happens in order management or whatever it might be, and it can be hyper disruptive to the business, and you could lose even more money through the disruption than just paying for a resource that you may never end up using. So what we try to do is we try to strike a balance, but we erred on the side of caution is what we did. We said, okay, we may not use this full resource, but what we can do is, even if they're not using their time to directly support us with a bug or a problem or a configuration, we're going to use that resource for friggin' training. And we're basically going to utilize that. We will figure out a way to, if we've booked 40 hours in a month, we are going to find a way to use that 40 hours.
Exactly. And one thing I think people don't understand, especially when you talk about these complex implementations, is when you go to that support person, I think that is the example that you gave. And when you go to them, so the risk is not just the time, the risk is much bigger. Okay. The standard operating procedure in the support world is, when you are not able to solve something, then just restart your computer, right? That's how they like to think. Sometimes it could be just delete your cache or whatever. They could do crazy things. And because they don't necessarily understand the implications, they are trained on certain scenarios, so it could fire pretty bad. And that's why I guess for some time you need to be really careful, unless the system is completely stabilized. You really need to make sure that you have that capacity, at least from the consulting perspective, so that somebody is supervising for the most part, if they are not going to be for the support. So that would be my point on using the support resources, or relying on support resources.
Yeah, and then I think there's also the question of business hour support, 24/7 support, tier P1, P2, P3 support. There's all sorts of different scenarios where you could say, okay, if it's in NetSuite, okay, a save search isn't right. Okay, that's not a P1 support issue. I can still continue to transact. It's not going to affect my business. But if a key integration failure or a key order management process or something like that happens, that could down tools for 30 people in the business overnight. And striking that balance, I think, between business hour support, 24/7 support, also the tiers of support based on certain criteria, really clearly understanding, what does your partner document and define as a priority 1 support issue, a priority 2 support issue, and a priority 3 support issue? And what do they expect the turnaround to be within each of those tiers? So I for example, I wanted to know, give me some examples of a P1, P2, P3 issue. Give me some examples off the top of your head. Document them. And I want them actually in the agreements, example scenarios like this. And what is the turnaround time from first response? What is the expected time to resolution? I wanted that super clear in my agreement, because otherwise nobody knows what the expectations are, both internally and externally, when the proverbial shit hits the fan.
And one of the things that I notice, and people always complain, the users always complain, that when they try to get answers, even if you're going to have a consulting team from the OEMs, SIs, they don't necessarily get the answers. And there's a little gap in their skill set, because generally they are going to have really good product skills, technical skills, but they are not necessarily good at translating that in the business or in your language, okay, to really break it down for you. And that's where I guess the consulting help is going to be really helpful. So don't expect that, okay, just because you have P1, P2, P3 support, as well as even if you have consulting hours. And sometimes consulting hours from, let's say if you're going to get that from any vendor, I don't know how meaningful that is going to be, because you are not necessarily getting the real consulting. Okay, you are getting real technical product help even within that group. Sometimes even for us, I don't know whether you have experienced this or not, Jason, but dealing with them even for us could be very difficult sometimes, just because they just don't understand the business scenarios. They don't necessarily speak our language. We are trying to tell them something, they are speaking something else. So it becomes a friction point. That is our consistent experience, especially if you are going to deal with somebody who's going to be relatively junior. I would say they are probably trained on very few scenarios. Maybe they are a trainer in 90% of the cases. When these OEMs, SIs, they brand these people that, okay, you have this person for the support, okay, I'm going to sell you 30 hours at this rate, $200 an
Yes.
hour or whatever. Generally their experience is very limited. They are probably going to have 2 3 4 years experience. Maybe they have a little bit of pre-sales experience, a little bit of professional services, but don't expect them to be like a solution architect or the
Oh,
enterprise
I don't
architect
even,
or
to be perfectly honest, I don't recommend anybody go with support from the vendor/OEM. I don't recommend it, because the reality is oftentimes they know less about their own platform than the
yeah,
SI or the implementation partner or the consultant does. They might know about one tiny little sliver of the platform, but the implementation partner has to know about the breadth and depth of the platform, because they're actually doing the implementations on a daily basis. And so I would say you need to be on a very strong support agreement with the implementation partner that actually did the implementation. And ideally, even if it costs you a little bit extra, I would say it's worth budgeting extra for the person that was actually the technical implementation lead on your project to
yeah,
have certain amount of support hours carved out with them for the first 1 to 6 months on a monthly. Maybe it drops. Maybe the first month you've got 20 hours or 30 hours or 40 hours with them. Second month it drops back to 30 hours. Third month it drops back to 20 hours, whatever it is. I recommend, and what we did and what saved our ass is that the technical implementation lead that followed us right through from discovery right through to go live, that lead, I hesitate to call them a consultant, but they were the lead implementation. They were the tech lead on the implementation.
yeah,
That person, we paid extra to have them basically on call 24/7 in that first 30 days after launch. And I tell you, was that a freaking godsend? Because even I knew, because I was creating my own test plan for my own department within the
yeah,
business. But I realized pretty quickly, and I spent about 3 or 4 days trying to write the test plan, and I realized there was a matrix of scenarios that were, I identified somewhere between 1 and 300 edge cases that there was
yeah,
no chance I was going to ever be able to test until this system was actually in production. There were extreme edge cases of certain combinations of customers from different regions and countries and payment methods and shipping methods. And if I took all the different variables that could come
yeah.
into place within that specific transaction, there's no way I could test every single combination of those variables. Impossible. And so I said, there's potentially some sort of combination of these variables in an order that's going to break something. And I need, if that happens, I need my technical lead on the freaking phone immediately to investigate that and figure out whether it's a configuration issue, is it an integration mapping issue, is it a field validation issue, where's the problem, and what do we need to do to fix it for this specific edge case. And I think every single business has edge cases like that they cannot predict in advance.
Yeah, it's very hard. I think you need to have plan, but then again, there is a balancing act in terms of how much you want to test versus what's going to be your budget for the implementation. In most cases, you can keep testing, but there is a limit to it as well. So that's a factor. Again, there is no silver bullet here in terms of this is how you should be doing the implementation. It's very contextual, and that's why the whole consulting expertise becomes very handy, because they need to make the judgment call. The person who really knows everything, the technical person that you mentioned, even though your hope and goal is going to be that they probably have some business knowledge, but in general their business knowledge is going to be limited, and you are not going to have enough knowledge to be able to translate that in a, I don't know, technical blueprint that they can
Correct.
follow, they can understand, they can detect the assumptions, risks. So that's where I guess the person who sits in between becomes extremely critical. They need to have complete control on the process, regardless of how many other vendors are going to be involved. And that is going to be another factor. In this case, I don't know how many implementation partners were there, but they have their limitations to that. Okay, they can only support, let's say, one product, two product, maybe two categories, three categories. But if you have 10 different tools, you are not going to find that from one vendor, right? So that's another challenge that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what I found to also be really good is in the lead up to launch, especially where you have multiple partners, multiple software vendors, multiple implementation specialists, and multiple internal SMEs that are having to all come together at this point of launch and cut over from old system to new system. Even if you leave access to the old system open to pull up historic records, etc., you still need to make at some point this concerted jump from old system to new system, and it's usually overnight. What we did when we implemented NetSuite, when we closed off the books at the end of the day at 5 p.m. or whatever it was on a Friday, basically we were like, okay, we're going to go live with the system over the weekend effectively, and we're going to make sure that this thing is tested in production as much as possible. We did all our testing in staging, but now we need to actually get live, do the cutover, and do some testing in production so that when the entire team comes back in on Monday morning and is ready to spool up the system and start going through the checklist that they know they need to go through, we want to make sure the system is at least ready to start using in a production environment. But what we found is that in the lead up to launch, in the 2 weeks right before the cutover, we started having daily 15-minute stand-ups with
Yeah.
every single vendor lead, tech lead, and internal lead in the business. And we literally, this was almost like we set up basically like a war room where we would all be on a 15-minute call, some people dialing in, some people in person, and we would all go through, okay, where are we at? What are the final things? Do we have any blockers? Who needs to work on those blockers? Who needs to collaborate on those blockers? What's next? And how do we clear these blockers in preparation for launch? And so that meant basically Monday through Friday for 2 weeks, we were having a daily stand-ups. That's 10 stand-ups in the lead
Yeah.
up to launch. And then we carried on. We had those stand-ups scheduled for a further 2 weeks post-live. So literally every single day with every single key vendor, partner, tech lead, everything around the table, 15 minutes. And, admittedly, within a week, those sessions usually didn't even take 15 minutes. They were like 5 minutes. It was like, nope, we're good here. We're good here. We're working on this is a little bug here. Cool. You're resolving that. You're resolving that. And that would be my recommendation based on my experience, which is you need a forum, especially in the lead up and immediately after launch, where this is already booked out in everybody's calendar to where everybody can attend and they know they have to attend to make sure that we can resolve issues immediately and we don't have any dependencies on an email or a phone call or a Slack message. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, this is completely true. And you need to have this not only during this phase, during the implementation phase as well, because the engagement is going to be the key, even with users. So you need to have clear communication plan. If you don't have weekly check-ins, even during the implementation or the selection strategy phase, users might get disengaged. They might forget things. So you need to have check-ins always throughout the project until the project is there. Once it is stabilized, then it's a different case. You did for that, let's say 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. It doesn't matter. I would recommend that do it for some more time, because you are going to have scenarios, let's say in 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. I don't know what the timeline is, but you generally have that. So you want to keep that for a couple of months at least.
Couldn't agree more. And I tell you, it gave everybody such a sense of certainty. It gave them confidence. It felt like there was a safety net in place, that nobody was going to slip through the cracks, that somebody was going to get overlooked or some issue was going to get overlooked, or we were going to go on hold for 24 hours while a help desk dealt with issues. No, we had basically, it was almost like a special operations team that was. So yes, I think pre 2 weeks, in the lead up to the 2 weeks before launch, we started out having 2 weekly stand-ups, then it would move to 1 weekly stand-ups with the entire team. And then in the 2 weeks, it was every single day. And then for the 2 weeks post-live, it was every single day. And then it started to drop back to sort of Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Then it dropped back to twice a week, like a Tuesday and a Thursday. And then it dropped back to once a week. And then eventually it dropped back to where, hey, this is a on-demand type of call. We'll schedule things in on an as-needed, on-demand basis. But I just think that if businesses will appreciate the fact that an ERP implementation is perhaps the single most disruptive piece of technology they will ever implement in their business, they need to treat it with that level of gravity. That's my take.
Exactly. Could not agree more. In fact, I'll probably give you some stories, and I think you wanted to talk about the failure as well. So we can touch on those stories and talk about what happens in the real world. So this particular story, in this particular case, we got called in, and they were like, "Hey, we had implemented, a system. Now we are looking for some sort of technical help." And generally, when people say they are looking for some sort of technical help, the problem is much bigger. Okay, in our experience. So we are like, okay, you are looking for some sort of technical help. What do you need? So they are like, okay, we have the system called, let's call it, I don't know, Microsoft Dynamics Business Central. It doesn't matter which system that is, right? They all are going to have some sort of issues depending upon how the implementation is done. And they are like, we have many bugs. We are chasing every time. These bugs are always there. And we want to have some sort of control review to see what is happening. Are we heading in the right direction or not? And maybe you guys can help us code as well. Okay, let's see what you have. Then we go there, and obviously they were bucketing this under this particular system. But then when we go there, they had at least, I don't know how many different add-ons, at least 10 to 15 different add-ons. They had many different systems that were branded under this whole Microsoft. The code bases was owned by all of these parties. And the situation was they were live on the system. Obviously, they had a lot of issues in that system that they were literally processing sales orders manually, to be completely honest. Okay, and once those sales orders were processed, then somehow they had figured out the process, how to manage that inside the new system. The luckily for them, they still had access to the old system, so at least they were good there. Now, in the new system, there were like hundreds and hundreds of bugs on a daily basis. Okay, just crazy amount of bugs. And you're like, okay, why the hell are you getting these bugs? You should not have these many bugs. I don't feel comfortable in any ERP system. If you are getting those many bugs, I probably don't want to touch that system, to be completely honest, or that engagement, because that is just a scary experience for us. It seems like a very uncontrollable situation.
The way I think of it is it becomes a black hole of time for you and potentially for the business, because you're going, am I expected to take ownership over from 5 different vendor partners or 5 different implementation partners or whoever's responsible for these individual components of the system? Am I expected to pick up and run with that and take some level of ownership over that when I didn't do the initial implementation? It puts you in a very awkward position if you are expected to resolve all bugs, regardless of where the bug should realistically sit in terms of responsibility.
Yeah, the reality is that, like in this situation, their loss was that they didn't even understand how many different contracts, vendors, how many different components were involved. So, from their perspective, the only thing they knew is they have just one system, okay? That one system needs to be technically coded. Now,
Wow.
it was that bad that they didn't even understand what was sitting underneath. So that's where I guess the major problem is. And then when we started uncovering, okay, let's see what all do you have here, where the problem is coming from. Generally, as the ERP consultant, you go to anybody, one of the things that they are going to do is they are going to compare this with some sort of fresh installation. Okay, they are going to, each of the screen that you have, each of the fields that you have, if you are going to have any sort of deviations, sometimes those deviations are very hard to predict, because these guys may have changed the state of the system completely. Now you are not going to find any sort of documentation, the use cases, scenarios anywhere where you can do some sort of studying with open source when you are dealing with the real technology. In that case, you at least have some sort of technical documentation you can debug. The problem with the enterprise software is you are really handcuffed in terms of what you can do. Your number of options that you have in the enterprise software is very limited depending upon what the underlying system has exposed. You really need to follow their rules. And the easiest way to debug is going to be, give me a fresh environment and let me compare everything and let me see what has been done. Now, when we are looking at this implementation, in this case, they had created fields literally everywhere. Okay, wherever you are, sometimes those fields must have been mapped as data elements. These guys had no understanding of how supply chain was supposed to be done, how business was supposed to be done, just kept customizing. I don't know who was driving this, maybe business was driving, and they were like, okay, fix technically, however you can, come back. Okay, and these guys were trying, and because of that, you had all of these issues, and now we are trying to map the state. Okay, all right, so you have the object 1, you have object 2, you have screen 1, you have screen 2, you have table 1, you have table 2. It's not adding up. what's going on here? And then the problem is that if you are not keeping the state the way your supply chain objects are supposed to be structured, you are going to have substantial implications. I don't know whether I told this story on one of the episodes or not. It's a very common problem to mix the data sets. For example, you mix a data set that belong to your customer, put it on product, or a data set that belong to your product, put it on customer. You are going to find interesting challenges because the underlying reports, underlying queries that might be built, they are built with a certain assumption. And if you don't follow those assumptions, we cannot predict how that is going to fire back. So this is just one of these stories where we have seen this, where it's almost like the state of uncontrollable implementation. Okay, now even if you hire the best guy, they are probably going to be limited with their skill set in terms of what can be done, because you have to somehow bring this to a very manageable state. And it could be hard if you have so many different underlying pieces, so much of customization sitting on top of it. I don't think anybody can do much. And now in this particular case, the whole story went for, I don't know, post implementation, it was like maybe 3-4 years they were doing crazy things, and every year they were investing like 2-3-4 million dollars just in maintaining that. Can you believe? Yeah. Yeah, it was that
Wow.
bad. Yeah.
Wow. I've got another story that aligns with this. So I was working with a PE company that had bought a roll up over a period of a few years. They had bought 60 different companies working in the same industry globally in different areas, different regions, different categories, and they brought them all together under one roof. So they got 60 different business units, and most of them have their own unique ERP. So there was a little bit of an overlap. A couple of business units were running the same ERPs, but for the most part, I think they had 40 or 45 ERPs
Yeah.
across the company. They were trying to do a standardization on one of the major global ERP players. Within the first, I think it was either year or 2 years, they had burned through 3 implementation partners. So they were on their third implementation partner, and by year 2, I think it was, they had expected to be halfway through the migration of half their business units over to this standard system that they were going to run globally, multi-subsidiary ERP, to where all of these businesses were just going to be subsidiaries underneath one ERP with one common core data set that was shared across all business units. And I was just thinking to myself when I was told this story, I was thinking, if you burn through 3 implementation partners for a start off, you should probably also be looking heavily at yourself, because it's highly unlikely that all 3 implementation partners were absolute rubbish. And the funny thing is, all 3 of those implementation partners were recommended by the platform vendor. So they were saying, hey, we think that these implementation partners will be able to do the job. It's a big job, but we think they've got the capabilities. They churned through 1, churned through 2. Now they're on number 3. You have to start asking yourself, what's the common denominator here? It's not the partner, it's us. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, you lose so much continuity when you are chopping and changing between implementation partners, that everything the first partner learned and everything the second partner learned, the third partner has to relearn when they come in and they start scoping with you. So to your point, I think it's a real risk if you are chopping and changing and jumping around, and you got 3 or 4 different partners owning 3 or 4 different things, or they're running different departments in your business or something like that. I think there's a real risk that there is no one single person that actually understands from a high level the way everything is architected. And without that, you are going to really struggle.
We were talking about the partners, right? So changing the partners is probably the last thing that you want to do. In general, you lose the tribal knowledge, and that's where I guess your documentation is going to be really handy, depending upon what level of documentation that you have done in your previous phases. But in general, you never ever want to lose your partner. That's probably not the best thing to do. If it comes down to that, okay, the partner is really bad, then figure out a plan, because there will be substantial overhead to your project if ends up being that. So that would be my take on the partner story. In general, things are very challenging when you talk about these implementations. So you want to have complete control and have some core dependable people who are going to keep the state clean, I would say. From the partner resourcing perspective, not all partner resources are going to be key, but the ones that are really driving are probably going to be the most critical. You need to have at least a couple. So if one person is not available, then at least you have some of those. So have some options there.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think your implementation partner ends up being like a marriage. You're not only married to the platform vendor / OEM, but you're also married to your partner. And the reality is that for good or for bad, you should be real, just like in real life and our romantic partners. We should be real cautious about people we marry and join our finances with and join our entire life with, and perhaps even have kids with. We should be equally cautious about the implementation partners and the vendor partners that we get into bed with, because this is not a short-term partnership. You've got, in most instances, for an ERP, you got between a 9 and an 18-month implementation window. You then, in order to get even reasonable ROI out of a platform, you're probably looking at a minimum of 5 years before you can even say that you've got decent ROI out of the platform. You've really, truly adopted it and maximized its value to the business. And then when it comes to the partner, as you rightly point out, if you dump the partner, then there's a whole lot of tribal and institutional knowledge lost. And if you lose key staff internally during that window of time, that only exacerbates the challenge. And so I would say do everything in your power when we're talking about mitigation strategies. Do everything in your power to incentivize people in the business to stay on at least until you get live. Even if someone's thinking of leaving 2 months, a strategic internal resource is thinking of leaving 2 months before you go live, I would say, look, hire them back as a consultant, hire them back on an hourly rate basis, a contract basis, do whatever you have to do to retain that knowledge in the business. And obviously, if someone passes away or something like, or moves out of country or something, maybe it's impossible. But I would say, within reason, do everything in your power to retain both your internal project team and your external implementation partner team, the same team, and to keep as much consistency across that for the duration of the project as you possibly can. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's why the fine balance is really important. I guess the companies that are really successful, they understand the balance needs to be there. So they retain some capacity from the external partners as well. Yes, they rely on internal, but internal, as you correctly pointed out, those issues are always going to be there. You have the same risk with the internal people as you have with the external people. And that's why generally the companies are slightly better, the consulting companies, in retaining that knowledge, because they are in that business. So they are most likely going to have some sort of documentation. They can do the knowledge handover fairly quickly. So you don't have the same risk that you are going to have with your own internal people. But again, depending upon the vendor that you are dealing with, sometimes the vendors could be all over the place as well, that it's really a staffing agency. If that is the case, then you don't have much of a choice, because every time a new person is going to join, they are going to ask the same questions. So then they don't really have, it's probably going to be a very similar experience there. But if you deal with decent consulting companies, they are generally very good at retaining knowledge from one person to the next, one team to the next, and the other person can pick up very easily in general. So that would be my take on keeping the balance on both of these.
Makes sense. Any other, as we come down to the end of this fourth and final episode, any other key things that you see as being, if we were to think about why ERP projects typically fail, is there any one last sort of parting thoughts of things that you see that are just so super common, pitfalls, gotchas, whatever, and potential ways to avoid those nasty thorns?
Yeah, so I guess I don't know how much we have touched on data migration. I know we have touched in different capacity, but data is where the major challenges are going to be. And that's where you are going to have a lot of surprises as well. In general, let's say if your project plan is going to be that, hey, I have inputted my data inside the system, but then let's say if you have not tested, sometimes those data sets may not be available for you post implementation. So you are going to have a lot more effort there as well from the data migration perspective. In general, the new state is going to be very different, how you are going to correlate, reconcile across your data sources. So that would be my take in thinking about that. Build the overarching plan. In general, let's say if you're working with the implementation partner, they are only going to do plan from their perspective, their product, whatever they are supporting, but then you also have the overarching plan. That overarching plan is far bigger, and you need to take the responsibility yourself. If you don't know how to take that, then you need to hire a consulting firm that can help you with that, because there are going to be a lot of different moving pieces. The whole transition plan, there's just too many things, and sometimes these guys are following very fixed framework that we had discussed in the previous episode. So from their perspective, it might not be visible. Their success criteria may be very different, but even if it is successful from their perspective, the project may not be successful. So
and definitely not successful from your perspective. If you can't transact, if you don't have all your customer data in there, if you don't have all your product data in there, if you don't have all your price list data in there, if you don't have, there's certain occasionally some transactional data that you usually start from scratch, ideally in a new ERP, no transactional data, and you try to cut over maybe at the beginning of the financial year or something, but sometimes it can't be helped. Sometimes you've got some transactional data spread across multiple systems over a period of time. Basically, if those data sets are not current, and what I always suggest is that people actually start integrating other production systems to the new ERP before the final cutover. Like that they're actually testing and they're keeping up to date. They're doing deltas even before they fully cut over and start operating full time out of the new ERP system. That, for example, they keep deltas of price lists up to date. They keep deltas of customer data up to date from the old system to the new. So that maybe they do a massive migration a month before launch or 2 months before launch, and then maybe once a week they do deltas so that the existing production system data and the new system data are at least at parity across everything except transactions, right? So that products, price list, customer data, addressing, all that sort of stuff, supplier data, all that sort of stuff, cost-based data, all that sort of stuff, at least that stuff can stay at parity so that you don't have to do this massive data sync right before you go live with the new system. That you can check, you can spot check things, you can make sure it's current, you can make sure everything's working properly before you go live. And that would be my one final suggestion: is don't expect to be able to do your data migration, your production data migration, all right before, in the 24 hours before cutover. Because sometimes we had this when we did the cutover from an old ERP to NetSuite. We found that that we did some tests of data ingestion and data upload, and the amount of time we had to start doing that data migration like a month out, because of the sheer volume of records we had and the time it took to get them ingested by the system. It took so long, and we had to break them down into smaller and smaller blocks of CSVs for upload, that it took a long time to get our initial cut of data into the system. And I'm really glad we did those tests, just those load tests, just to try to identify, okay, we've got 100,000, or I think it was more like 500,000 customer records. Cool. Okay, we can do 1,000 records or whatever it was, 10,000 records an hour, whatever it was. Okay, it's going to take us this long to get them all in. Okay, cool. We've got these addresses, we've got all this product data, we've got XYZ, and we just did some tests and we did some back of the napkin math and said, look, we're going to need 2 weeks to get this initial load of data in the system. I think that people need to think about these seemingly components of a migration. These can take much, much longer than you think they will.
Exactly. And the other thing that they need to keep in mind is keeping the relationship warm with the vendor that you are losing. Because in general, you can never predict how the implementation is going to go once you are live. Okay. Even the best consultants, I don't think they can confidently say that the implementation is always going to be smooth. So there's always a possibility that you might need to come back to your old system. Okay, so don't burn the bridges. Okay, don't plan your implementation from the get-go that, okay, hey, my contract is in 9 months, I need to go live in 9 months, and I'm going to lose this relationship. Obviously they are probably going to come to know, but keep the relationship warm, keep the system, I would say, at least for a couple of months until you are fully stable, fully migrated to the new system. And after that, if you have to lose, but keep the relationship warm, that'll go a long way, because you can always come back to that just in case if things don't go as planned. So that would be my take on keeping the relationship.
I could not agree more. We did that exact same thing. We paid for licensing of the old system for an extra couple of months because our implementation ended up taking a little bit longer than what we initially expected. And so we were like, hey, we know we don't want to pay for another year, but let us pay for another couple of months. It's going to cost us more, a little bit more monthly to go month to month, but at least we've got access to that old interface. We've got access to the old data sets. Now, eventually, what we were going to do is we're going to archive off the database anyway, to where we would always have access to it, but it was just going to be harder to access the data than an in-production system. It's always easier to access an in-production system. So we just paid for, I think it was an extra 3 months, maybe a quarter. I think it was a quarter we paid for access to the old interface, the old system, the old database, just so that we could go in, we could spot check data, we could download CSVs if necessary, we could download old price lists, we could download all the old data if we got into strife where, hey, somebody does an upload and one line of data is, or one column of data is out of order. Now you've got, whoa, okay, where do we go back to the original master? And so I totally agree with you. Do not burn bridges unless you absolutely have to in some way, or unless it gets legal. Try to keep and maintain that relationship with old vendors, old partners, etc., because you never know when you're going to need them, even with the new system. So amazing advice. This has been a fantastic 4-episode run. Sam, super appreciate your time. You're a freaking legend. How do people get a hold of you if they want your advice, if they want your help with ERPs? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, super easy. You just need to Google Sam Group WBS Rocks or Elevatiq. I'm probably going to be the first link. Very approachable, very reachable. You can ping me on LinkedIn anytime. Reach out to from the website Elevate, Elevatiq. Super easy.
Love it. Sam, you're a freaking legend, and I super appreciate your time.
You are.
Maybe we'll do this. Maybe we'll do this a year from now. Maybe we'll do a follow-up master series on all the new stories from the trenches that we have to share. Thank you so much, mate. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.